this track, we talked about protests and talked about questions like how do you make sure people are educated without gatekeeping the space, and provocations like partisanship and protest. This is a super informative conversation, and I can't wait for you to watch it. So, without further ado, here is the track. Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Trek. The Trek is a Civics Unplugged series where community members participate in meaningful discussions on topics that are too often neglected when thinking about building the future. Through prompting questions and provocations, we venture together into complex but important conversations related to building the future and democracy. We understand that this work requires ongoing dialogue, but it's a journey worth trekking through. My name is Madison. I'm a high school senior from Verdigris, Oklahoma, joined by some of our community members, and today we are talking about protests, and we always start off with a word association. So when you see your name on the screen, go ahead and share the 1 to 3 words you associate with the topic and why.
I can get us started. Hi, my name is Chabu Kapumba, and I am a builder in this community. And when I think of activism, when I think of protests, I think of the words introduction to activism. It is like the first version of what our role could look like in contributing to democracy if you're not like a politician or a nonprofit. Obviously, there's a lot more to it, but that's what comes to mind.
Hi everyone, my name is Angel. I am 19 and I am a first year. And when I think of protests, honestly, the first phrase that comes to mind is like, what is the right way, or the right way? I feel like whenever, specifically when there's a protest against an instance of police brutality, there is always the call from, I guess, opponents of the protests as to whether or not it's the right way to express dissent. And I just feel like there's never a right way. I feel like there's always going to be a double bind as to how we go about expressing our like disapproval.
Hi, my name is Freya. I am turning 16 this year. I'm a sophomore in high school. I think the first word that comes to mind when I think of protests is rights. So most protests these days are based on the lack of rights for certain groups of people, or more rights to the ones that already exist for other groups. Um, Definitely, there are other protests that include more, but this is the first word that comes to mind for me.
Hi, everybody. My name is Phoebe. I'm a senior from high school senior from the Washington, D.C. area. And when thinking about protests, the first word that comes to mind is disruption, just because protests are meant to sort of, I guess, challenge the current system, because it's not something that we consider to be in the system, even though it's protected under in the Bill of Rights. So it's not voting, it's not lobbying, it's just something that's meant for people who I think aren't caught up in government life. It's a really, I guess it's a declaration of anger directly, and it's loud and it's disruptive and it's meant to get attention.
Hi, I'm Ash. I use these are pronouns, and I'm a freshman in high school. I think the first thing that I think about when I think about protests is similar to what Angel said, all the different ways that you can protest. I think that recently we talked about art as a protest, and the way that like that fits into the equation, and all the different ways that you can protest what is happening around you.
Hey, I'm Gary calling in from New York City. I'll say increasingly criminalized, like in Florida, where they passed new laws making it a lot easier to get categorized as a rioter.
I don't see my name. I think.
Sorry, I didn't realize you joined, Nameeshka. Let me go ahead.
I think whenever I think of truth, hello, I'm Nameeshka. I'm a high school sophomore, but passed out from sophomore. When I think of protests, I think it is a clear indicator of democracy, because I don't think in a non-democratic country protests would be a thing. And if people are protesting, if they're talking, it's an indicator of the fact that the country has a healthy democracy.
Hi, I'm Sam. I'm also a sophomore. And I think of right. I know that's kind of similar to some other ones, but I think that everybody has a right to disagree in a peaceful way, and that shouldn't be taken away or minimalized.
Yeah, so mine would be everything is politicized, because even though the right to protest should be something that we all agree upon as Americans, depending on the issue, as Angel mentioned, it is either villainized or praised depending on which party you support. So yeah, thank you all for sharing those word associations. Now we can go ahead and hop into the conversation. Does anyone have a question or provocation to get us started off with? If not, I have one kind of along the lines of my word association, and I think it's a good place to get to start off with, especially what's happened in the last year. So partisanship and protests is my provocation.
I can start off with a response. Sheesh. Okay, I think the relationship between partisanship and protests, I'm going to speak specifically in the US context, is very, like, the relationship is very much evident. I feel like it manifests specifically in like the, let me say, the asymmetrical appliance of different, I guess, metrics of what we deem to be a good protest. I am just reminded of the protests from last year of the white men going up to the Michigan Capitol with firearms protesting the COVID mask mandate, and how people on the like mainstream conservatives were like, they're just utilizing their rights, they're just protesting, and that's something that's guaranteed by the Constitution, by the Bill of Rights, whatever. But then we have something, let's say something as asinine as Colin Kaepernick kneeling during the national anthem, and that is seen as an abomination. And that's because of how politicized, I guess, the context in which they were protesting are, right? So Black Lives Matter, police brutality, unfortunately, people's lives are deemed as political, but when it's a white person doing it, guess it's not.
Yeah, I want to piggyback off what Angel said, especially with the media. It just seems like parties have different rules for different people in terms of what like an okay protest is and like what isn't. Like a lot of people who were upset about some of the looting that happened during the Black Lives Matter protests last summer were either not complaining or just diminishing what happened with the insurrection on January 6th and classifying that as a valid protest, but classifying another form of destructive protest as not. So it's just, I think it's just really unfair how politicized everything is, and also like which type of protests get like media coverage. Like if there's two protests going on for the same cause and one of them is peaceful and non-violent and another protest they're like looting and burning stuff down, yeah, of course they're gonna film the one that's like burning stuff down. Of course that's what's gonna get the media attention. And I think that leads again to people necessarily associating certain protests and certain acts of protest with causes, and it can just become really messy. But the one thing that I really remember from like the American school system teaching me was just sort of like the juxtaposition between like the Black Panthers and Malcolm X versus like Martin Luther King and SNCC. And it was always like Martin Luther King is just automatically better because he preached nonviolence. Malcolm X, Black Panthers were a little more militant. that's bad. Even though they were arguably fighting for like the same cause, not necessarily like not the same platform entirely, but still in the fight for civil rights, especially for African Americans at the time. But that's just my 2 cents.
I feel like
Go ahead.
No, I just want to say I think that there's almost like 2 types of protests. In the context of partisanship, a protest can easily be like the manifestation of like the most polarized variations of America. Like you participate in protests if you just like firmly and almost like exclusively believe in something, or another like version of protests are ones that pop up because so many people agree on the same thing. So it's either like a minority's opinion or like a smaller group within the country's opinion or perspective, or it is simply like the majority opinion. And I think that's really interesting because either way, like you're in an extreme situation. And I love what Phoebe and Angel brought up about the fact that like every protest has almost like a completely different context of its own. And they're not necessarily treated the same.
I have a question to Chabu's answer. I don't see how there would be a protest if it's a majority opinion. At least in my view, there are protests only for minority opinions, and protests are conducted to showcase what the minority feels. And to answer like the provocation given up, I feel like at least in the US, there is so much partisanship. I mean, it's such a stark divide between Republican ideas and democratic ideas that if you recognize yourself like as an official Republican, you kind of not. I mean, it kind of blocks you from looking at a lot of ideas, like for example, Black Lives Matter. These are inherently from the leftist party, and I don't think that exists in a lot of countries because there isn't so much of a stark divide between two major political parties in other countries.
I'm just gonna pick up off from what Nameeshka said. I think labeling over here plays like a very important role because once you associate labels to certain topics or certain protests, you kind of narrow down your vision because you block out any other form of opinion. And I just want to add on an example to what Phoebe said. She mentioned the Black Panthers and Martin Luther King. It's been like that all over. It's like, for example, take the history of India. Everyone preached like the non-violence from Mahatma Gandhi and stuff. And even though there were other freedom fighters fighting for the absolute same reason, they weren't ever glorified in history because of the fact that their methods were different, more violent. And I think one very interesting point to notice here is that back then it was always about how non-violence got the attention of everything. And now non-violent protests aren't even covered by the media.
Yeah, and to like add to Nameeshka's provocation, the how can there be a protest if it's the majority opinion? I think that I feel like not the majority of protests, but a lot of protests occur because there is widespread agreement as to what the government should be doing, but the government isn't doing it. Case in point, climate change protests. I believe the majority of Americans, I could be getting my figures wrong, so don't quote me on that. But I believe the majority of Americans believe that there should be some form of climate action. And yet we're still having protests concerning the government's inaction or unsuitable action towards, I guess, addressing climate change. So that's an interesting thing to think about as well. And I feel like even though we usually focus on the US, I don't know what this says about the nature of politics in general, but I feel like division exists everywhere. I'm thinking about Nigeria and their protest against SARS, which is the security for basically Nigerian police, and how there was deep division when it came to that protest between ethnic and somewhat religious lines. So I think it depends on the context of the country, but I feel like partisanship exists, except maybe not across party lines. The division will probably exist along like lines that are as defined by the society, if that makes sense.
I agree a lot with what Angel said. I also think it's an important thing to bring up that I think protests reveal a lot of disconnection between the government and the people, because if the majority of the people, or at least like a substantial amount, are calling for change and the government isn't doing anything about it, what does that say? I don't know. I guess that's why we're all here at Civics Unplugged, to figure that out.
Yeah, I think what I like interpreted like what I quote unquote called the majority opinion to be is when there's like misalignment between the government and like the people that the government is governing over. That's unique in of itself. So just like thinking about even the protests that happened this summer with Black Lives Matter, or the farmers protests that were happening in India also earlier this year, like those are protests of misalignment. And just thinking about like methods of systems change, it's really contingent on the fact that like you have to hit almost like a critical number for that protest to actually be effective, which makes me wonder, like, if you can't have a protest with like a lot of people and like make a lot of waves about it, what is the point of protest if it's not like a mass participation or like an insanely large movement behind it?
I think what I've building off of what Chabu just said, what I find interesting about protests is they shine a light on the issue for like a short amount of time if you can't keep it going. Like I remember watching the Black Trans Lives Matter march in, I think it was Brooklyn. Maybe that was a year ago. And I was like, yes, like this really needs attention. Like we have Black trans people, we have trans people in general, like dying because of who they are, because they can't access healthcare, because the government doesn't recognize them for their identities, because people are awful. And then, you know, weeks pass and it's still not getting the coverage that it needs. And like protests, they shine that light. And if you don't take action, if you don't hop on that wave, if you don't get enough people to recognize it with a protest, then I feel like it gets glossed over. So like making sure that your protest is effective, I think is super important.
I just want to go back to the previous provocation for a second and point out that when we talk about the majority and minority, it does not have to specifically relate to like a religious or an ethnic or even a racial or gender minority. It's a minority or a majority over here just refers to people having an opinion or an agreement in something. And that's why a majority opinion over here is much more important than a minority opinion. Like, not because of the fact that it might be right or wrong, but because of the fact that a majority opinion is more likely to get coverage and attention.
Ash actually said something that made me think about an experience that I had in activist spaces, in the sense that like I went to a high school where we were almost like required to come up with some kind of like activism project at the end of a lot of our classes. And so what people ended up doing was like, oh, like I'm going to raise awareness on this issue. And I started to like just hate raising awareness campaigns, because especially with like the access to information that we have now, we are very rarely in a situation where people don't know what's wrong. And so that in itself almost feels like a moot point. And so I think that it's really important to like center whatever is being raised like around a tangible solution and pushing energy behind that rather than just like reiterating the fact that this is a problem that exists and it's important.
Now, if I look at completely from the market perspective and from coverage, I think a protest is more likely to get coverage if it's from a majority opinion, from if it's from a majority view, or if it's non-violent. But what people don't understand is that if it's non-violent, you kind of lose the opportunity cost that happens if it's violent. Like for example, you're more likely to get things done faster if you have a larger audience than if you um, than if you're violent. For example, if I have say 10 people um, using violence to protest something, but I have this at the same time I have say 100 people using non-violence to protest something, the 100 people are more likely to get more audience and um, to get their thing done faster, to get their what they're protesting for done faster.
I
That's
kind of Go ahead. Go ahead.
thanks. I was just gonna say that I think even if, like, obviously the point of a protest is to be like effective and actually get something done and have change, but even like in the cases when, like, say a protest just doesn't like catch on or there wasn't a large enough audience, I still think it can be really beneficial, because if the people for the people who do see it, it can be like there's someone who hears the problem, there's someone who cares about it, and that can be reassuring. And it's also like protesting takes practice to be able to make it effective too. Not in all cases, but I think practice can definitely help, even if it's not as effective as you want it to be.
Um, I just wanna kind of disagree with Nameeshka's point, like about at least about the non-violence and violence part. Because I think even with 10 people, if you have a violent protest, there's a higher chance of you getting noticed because the fact that it is so disruptive. But unless and until the divide between a violent protest and a non-violent protest is really, really high, there is high chances that your violent protest would probably get noticed more, at least in the media, solely due to the fact that it is so much more disruptive and it's going to cause much more of a mayhem than a non-violent protest. And so the purpose of a protest is not the number of people you have. It's a personal opinion, but it's more about the number of people whose attention you catch.
I've been thinking about what Chabu said for like 5 minutes now. I think if you don't have a specific objective to your protest, it's really hard to keep the energy going. If you don't have a specific ask, like if you aren't, for example, like I want you to vote for the Equality Act as my ask versus gender equality in general. Like you need an ask, you need something to get you started to kick off everything else, because you can raise a lot of awareness, but if you don't have a call to action, then that awareness just fades. And that's what I see happening a lot. And also, like, another thing I've been thinking about is protests that aren't led by people with experiences with them or people who haven't educated themselves a lot on the topic. Yeah, I feel like I want protests to be led by people who are part of the community that they're defending, part of the community that they're supporting. I don't want to see, like, I don't think this happens, but for example, like, I don't want to see a pride protest led by a cishet person. Like, that doesn't make sense. And making sure that movements center people who have been affected by it. And if you're going to be coming from a perspective outside of who is affected by this issue, educate yourself or step back and give that space to someone who's actually affected by this issue, because it's so much more powerful to have somebody who's affected by this issue, and it's so much more, I would say, correct to have somebody who's actually affected by this issue in front of you. And that's just something that is everywhere. It's all over leadership, but definitely in protests.
Pop off, Ash. Go off.
I agree with you so much. I mean, I completely understand what you're saying. To give you an example, not just leaders. I mean, anyone who participates in a protest should be completely educated about the cause. I mean, to give you an example, someone mentioned the Indian farmers' protest. I remember watching on the news and somebody getting interviewed, like some passerby who had joined the protest, and they had no idea what this was about. They were like, "Yeah, we saw a few people walking, and we're like, okay, why not walk with them?" And I'm like, it is a real cause. I mean, the farmers protest really had some gravity in what they were asking for. But people who have no idea and then join the protest actually kind of damper the energy of the entire group. Not, I mean, if I was a person who was not aware of any of the protests that was happening, but if you're an Indian, there is no way. That protest got so much news coverage. I mean, wow. But if I would laugh on that protest, because I would say I would say nobody in this protest knows what they're talking about. And I think people not getting to know what, I mean, the people who participate in a protest and they don't know what this thing is about, or they come with very limited knowledge. And I think that is something that happens very much in widespread protests.
Yeah, and this makes me want to pose a question kind of around like education or people having limited knowledges or experiences around the issue. So like, how do you kind of like walk the line between making sure people are educated and not like gatekeeping the activism or like protesting space?
I think Madison is like speaking to what are the boundaries and role of allyship, just in like activism in general, because all the examples that people brought up about like people almost like centering the conversation around themselves, even though it doesn't particularly like pertain to them or it's not their lived experience, has everything to do with the fact that like there has to that speaks to like what was the initial intention of even like being here in the first place, like what did you want to contribute to the space. um and a lot of times if it's not directly affecting you, then your contribution should be allyship, and a lot of allyship should just be like directed by being present and then also spending more time listening and being directed by those who are actually impacted rather than anything else.
I agree with you, Chabu, but I mean, I would want to see, for example, Ash gave this example, but I would want to see a cis white male in a pride protest, just because I would want to see how the outside world looks at the trans community, and just to see someone who's not for the cause, I mean, someone who's typically not supposed to be for the cause, come and actually support such causes. I think it would be a breath of fresh air.
I think I agree with that, and also at the same time, I think at least the media spends a lot of time being like, well, look at all of these white people who went to this Black Lives Matter protest. Look, we have support. And I'm like, but that's not like, you should be focusing on the general people, not the fact that there are white people here. Oh my gosh. And I think allyship in general could be a trek in itself, right? Like it's a whole line there of like, how do I support others without taking their space? And yeah, I think that's something that there's so much more to think about and ponder about. Like, am I supporting you or am I taking your space?
Yeah, 100%. I feel like there needs to be recognition that if you have not gone through the experiences that are being highlighted by the protests, You have the right to be there if you are supporting, but the key word is supporting, right? No one, and once again, I said this in the chat, but I feel like I see it a lot in climate activist spaces when considerably privileged people take the stories and speak for the people who have been most affected. Meanwhile, there are people who bear those identities who are actually doing the work who don't get that attention and who aren't being pushed to the forefront. And that to me is co-opting and not collaboration. And I think protests in which you want to be an ally, you have to learn that you need to, what is that common phrase that people use in organizing spaces? Like not step up, but step back, push forward, or something around that. I'll like Google it and put in the chat, but I think that's just such an important thing to keep in mind. So I don't necessarily think it's about gatekeeping. It's about telling people that they need to learn, like Chabu said, how to listen. Yeah, you don't need to respond to everything. You don't need to speak. Just like listening is enough.
I think it's about making sure you're telling the right story when it comes to a protest and a lot of, activism, organizing, advocacy, all of that stuff spaces. I just think like the best thing you can do as an ally sometimes is to just really just step back and just let someone else take the reins. Like, it's not about you. And that's why, like, I'm straight and I find it appalling when others, like a lot of straight white girls, will just go to Pride and act like it's a party and act like it's fun. But that's not like the point of Pride. Like, Pride was a riot. So I think, but just in general, like a lot of people co-opting protests for like an Instagram picture to be like, oh, like, look how like woke I am and look how much I'm doing and blah, 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 blah. It's just not about that. And I wish that people did that. Like, I think social media has helped protests a lot, but it's also hurt them in ways like that, just people using it to get clout.
Yeah, oh, go ahead.
I think like subjects like pride, climate change are romanticized too much. I mean, um, it's almost like if you go to Pride, it's like, oh my god, wow, that is so cool. It's become less more about supporting the LGBTQAI plus community. It's become more of tooting your own horn, saying that um, saying that, listen, I know what I'm aware of my privileges being a cis person and a straight person, but I'm here trying to tell you that, okay, I support you. I think we have to, like someone mentioned, stand back and stand. Is it stand back and stand by? The Trump quote is in my head. I'm sorry. Step up and step by. Uh, um, and I think we have to stop romanticizing two things: mental health and protests.
Yeah, that's a great point. And if someone wants to respond, they can go ahead and respond to this, but I just want to get this provocation down. Thinking about like what Phoebe was talking about, be it like, oh, and what Nameeshka was talking about too, with like romanticizing certain issues. I think of like the Pepsi commercial with Kendall Jenner when she's like giving them the Pepsi, and the cops and the protesters were all good. So thinking of like how companies are profiting off of it in that sense, and then also in the sense of like people virtue signaling, like that's kind of like a way that people are profiting off protests. So my provocation is profit and protests.
I just want to jump back to the previous provocation just for one tiny second. I think that listening and hearing about protests, or like when someone is telling their own story, is a major part in support of what brings stuff forward. Like just knowing that someone is out there listening to what you have to say is um not just a comfort to someone telling their story, but also a motivator. And I think that role also plays a big part in protests. And as to profit and protests, it's just that um, our society and economy has become so capitalistic that every issue, be it human rights or just every basic issue, has become a point of profit, not only to multinational companies, but to a lot of other things, like every, even media for that matter. I don't think there is a lot of media that covers protests and campaigns and just anything that's disruptive for the pure fact that, to spread awareness or to, shed light on an issue. It's more of on the basis that, this is going to get us more viewers, and more viewers means more money. And that is why we're going to cover that. It goes back to the whole covering violent protests more than covering non-violent protests.
There's just something that feels so wrong about corporations profiting off protests. Like, it drives me crazy. Like, I'm so upset about companies like releasing all their like statements, like, oh, like we stand in support, like we stand in solidarity, and then you look at the demographics of who's working at the company, you look at the wages that they're paying the employees, the way they treat their workers, and it just feels so dishonest. Yes, Amazon, oh my gosh. If I hear one more ad about Amazon telling me how they're like reducing emissions and like solving climate change, like I'm gonna actually end up buying Spotify Premium, because it just feels so performative and unnatural. And I know there was like a whole other track on greenwashing, but that's also a really important thing to bring up. Like, I feel like companies have figured out that Gen Z will just like buy anything that looks to be like climate friendly. So I'll see all these like sustainably and ethically sourced, but like, what does that mean? Like, what is that? We need to talk about that a whole lot more. And I also like, I know people refer to June now as Paint Capitalism Month because you see a lot of corporations making like Pride merchandise, and keep in mind these are not like LGBT owned businesses. So there's the question of, well, who's profiting off this protest? Because if someone's gonna profit off of it, shouldn't it be the community that we're supposed to be helping out? So there's that. However, the one good profit coming out of protests that I did see during the summer, I saw so many Twitter threads that were like, list of Black-owned businesses you can support. So I think if those people were able to get, some more business and because of the protests, I don't have a problem with it. But when corporations are being completely hypocritical and using this as an opportunity to make money and not actually reflect on what they're doing as a company, that's when it becomes an issue for me.
Yeah, I think tying it back to Pride, if I see one more Pride Target ad, like, I'm literally going to stop buying things from Target because it's so rude. I don't know how to say this. Like, it's just so
irritating. Is that the word you're looking for?
irritating. Yes, it's very irritating. Like, I'm really tired of watching like companies run by cishet white men be like, but we support these people, so you should support us. And I think Pride in its original form was a riot, and Pride evolved into a protest. And now Pride is just like, let me have all these capitalist companies show up and say they support us, so you should buy this rainbow shirt. And I don't know. I wish protests could go back to being about like grassroots organizing and less about like, oh, look, I'm a company and I need people to buy from me, so let me, support this cause and put out some statement so that I can get more people to buy from me. Like, protest is not supposed to be about capitalism. It's supposed to be about the people.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree, literally with everything that's been said. And I feel like outside of the monetary aspect of profit, I feel like there's, of course, also that like social profit that people have. And Phoebe touched on it earlier, but I think it's like there's a lot to be said about how our culture is, or not our culture, but our generation is just so prone to oh my God, virtue signaling. This is so funny, but I I know a person, I go to school with them. They are this online, they're this huge activist, right? They've organized protests, they've attended them according to their social media. And then I got the opportunity to meet them in person when I was on campus for a semester. And it is just so funny because their attitude, their personality did not align with any of the values that the protest or the things that they were protesting claimed, the things that they were protesting like preached, right? There was no respect for the racial demographic that they were intending to protect or that they claim to be protecting. And I think it's just so interesting how like people can post a picture of them being on going to like a Black Lives Matter protest, Madison beer, and yet not do, at least as we can tell, anything substantial to actually advance the movement. And of course, it's difficult to judge someone based on their social media, but like, I don't know, it's just, there's something icky about people who proclaim to be such like bastions of civil rights and don't necessarily live up to that image.
Just to play the devil's advocate, I think when multinational corporations kind of use protests to advertise and to gain profits, it also has a flip side. Um, because multinational corporations have a huge audience, when they advocate for example, when they advocate for, say, pride or climate change or Black Lives Matter, it kind of pushes the concept of the protest itself, um, and in its most purest form. I mean, if say Amazon is, I'm not completely aware of what Amazon did, but for example, if Amazon is saying, if it,
Okay, that
All right, sorry about that. See ya.
Oh, but just to like preface, this is a good place to have been stopped. We can move into reflection after Nameeshka finishes talking.
Can I say one quick thing before we do that too?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Not sure if she's gonna join back. Sam, you can go ahead and say what you're going to say.
Okay, so Phoebe mentioned this in the other chat about how it's like protesting has become kind of like trendy if you just post a picture of it and be like, oh, I'm doing this activism. And it's just, and it also ties back to like the social clout. But like, I don't know, that's just, and I see it a lot with mental health too, like people calling like having their pencils in a straight line and be like, oh, I'm so OCD. It's like, that's a really serious mental health issue, and it's hurtful for so many people. And so like, while social media does help, like, you know, gain attention for a movement, like it also becomes so easy to belittle it if people don't take it seriously. And that's a really hard thing to get across when so many people have social media.
I just wanted to bring up one point. It's that I don't know. There are quite a many issues around the world that haven't gotten enough recognition, purely because of the fact that there have been no protests, be it um, refugee camps or the brutality in refugee camps. Like, there's just so many things, but it just shocks me that if those issues were to be brought to light, uh, I have absolutely no doubt that somehow or the other they will also be used to um on profit. Like, yeah, I agree with certain points that Nameeshka was making before, but it is really, in simple terms, rude to make money off of someone's lack of rights, because I mean, you're debating whether another human being gets the same rights as you, and in that debate you're making money off of it, and I don't think that is anywhere near natural.
And before we move into reflection, Nameeshka, did you want to finish your point? I know you got cut off.
I have no idea what I was talking about. I'm sorry. My mem- my
No,
memory is goldfish. If someone can just remind me like
um,
one word.
yeah, so you were playing the devil's advocate and basically saying why the
Ah,
capitalism is good.
yes, yes. Thank you, Freya. Um, so, so I think when multinational I'm sorry, it's like 5:20 in the morning and I'm dead sleepy. But I think when you think of multinational corporations supporting ideas like pride and climate change, they itself is a good way to advertise a concept of a protest. And I think more so because multinational corporations do have a huge support and I mean huge crowd that they sell to and advertise to. I think this concept itself when put in front of many people they're like, okay, it's this simple, okay, we can support this. But at the same time when multinational corporations use that idea, but to be honest, I don't I've seen how people got cancelled when they don't support a particular idea, or when a company doesn't support a particular idea. Like, I don't think it is necessary for every goddamn company to release papers saying that we support pride and and we're working on climate change. I mean, you can do it. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just like, it's not that every goddamn company has to do it. And if a company doesn't do it, I don't think it's necessary that their sales shut down and the company shuts down and there's major backlash. I just think that 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 now it's become so redundant that, okay, if you're a company, you have to support woke views like pride and climate change.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and drop a link to the notes in the chat so that you all can look over them and think about your reflection, and I'll go ahead and get us started. This is a really good conversation, and something that I've been really thinking about because of the last provocation is, what is the line between there being like positive social pressure and it becoming like polarization? So like what I mean by that, like it can be argued that like it's good that companies are publicly supporting issues and that people are going to social media and are able to, I guess, kind of like profit from virtue signaling because it creates positive social pressure for people to, I guess, like support like a lot of human rights issues. But in that same breath, it can also become very polarizing, and then it becomes a political issue. So like, what's the line of that? And then in terms of that problem, and also like the whole question of like violence versus non-violence, obviously no one wants people to get hurt or whatever if or like businesses to be damaged if that does not have to be done in order for change to happen. But that's what people are incentivized to do right now in order for protests to be quote unquote effective. And so like, what is the solution to that? And then taking into account what I was saying earlier about the positive social pressure, like what are the unintended consequences of any of those solutions? Because I think that the way that media is formatted right now, a lot of that wouldn't have been originally foreseen.
I feel like those are such good questions to take. I feel like whenever I'm in a trek, I just leave with more questions. I think something that really stuck with me is like towards the beginning, Ash talked about like the effectiveness of protests and like what is really the point of a protest if it creates a lot of buzz in one moment but is forgotten in the next. And I've just been thinking about how sometimes a protest can quote unquote not fail, but fade back out of the public consciousness, not necessarily at the fault of the protesters themselves. Like they could have done everything in their power to organize effectively, but I feel like the success of a protest really reinforces existing power dynamics. Like there's this excellent poem by this spoken word poet named Portia O. It's called Rakia Boyd. If I find the link, I'll put it in the chat. But there's this line from once again, the poem named Rakia Boyd about how, let me remember it. Is her rally just a rehearsal? And it's about how like Black female, like the killing, the police brutality perpetrated against Black non-male bodies is not given enough attention in relation to like the police brutality committed against Black male bodies, and how Black Lives Matter sometimes is interpreted unconsciously by a lot of people as Black male lives matter. And so I feel like sometimes when protests don't garner a lot of attention, it's not necessarily because of, I don't know, like the protesters did one huge event and then didn't follow up. It's because there are like underlying ideologies that are kind of perpetrating these systemic imbalances or systemic inequalities.
I think, I'm sorry. I think one of the things that stuck with me is, I don't remember who said this, but there is no point to a protest unless you're pushing for a solution, because at this point, raising awareness is everyone knows about it. And even if they don't, they're going to hear about it at some point of time. And without a solution, of protest is just going to fade out eventually, as Angel just said. So yeah, I think that's one of the things that really stuck with me through this entire conversation for some reason.
I definitely echo Angel's sentiment of always feeling like I have more questions than answers after coming out of a trek. But I think I'm leaving today with thinking like how social media has changed the way that we protest, and how that has, brought in this whole culture of trends and virtue signaling and companies taking profit. Like it all comes together. And so now I'm left to think, is it all good? Is it all bad? I don't know. I guess we'll see you next time.
I think this check has not just left me with a lot of questions, but kind of segregated my thoughts more. Like I'm more aware of what I know and what I think of. And I completely agree with what Phoebe just mentioned. Like for example, when the Black Lives protests, to just give you some context, there aren't many Black people in India currently, or the only Black people in India are people who have come to study from African countries. But it was a huge clout if you post something about how Black Lives Matter, even though you per se are not doing anything for that concept. I mean, sitting in India, there is very little. There's something very little I can do to support that cause. And if I post on Instagram, for example, or Twitter saying that, oh, I support Black Lives, um, it, it, it has become less more about supporting the cause and more about tooting your own horn, like I mentioned earlier.
I'm sorry to like pick on this in the middle of like reflection, but it really gets to me. Nameeshka, you said that, we sit here and we talk about Black Lives Matter and we post about it. And sure, there are a lot of people who do it for the clout and the attention. But you have to understand that even as an Indian who is not directly affected by this, just the fact that I'm aware of it and I am making my fellow citizens aware of it, even though it's happening like 10 countries away, is an important sign that the protest got this far and we're taking it even further. Like, it might not affect me and I might not directly be able to do something, but the fact that I am listening to what the protesters or like the protest itself has to say, and I'm passing the message on, is a big deal. It might not be directly helping, or it might not be helping at eye level, but it in some way does change something or the other.
See, when you post something, it's more about what intention are you posting it with. um I mean, like, I don't know, I think it was you, Shreya, who said that uh, at this point, awareness per se is not a very important concept, because you have everything on the internet. I mean, almost everything you can find on the internet. And I don't think that you posting something and not really doing anything for the concept, or for the cause, I don't think it makes a huge big difference.
Um, this is one point I really have to disagree on. Like, yes, I understand the fact that I might not be able to really do anything, but it's not my personal fault that I am not in an area or a region that is affected by this. And as for the personal intention, I have no right to say what someone else posting, what something meant when they were posting. But I know that when I upload something on the internet, uh, I'm doing it with the intention of educating people about it. And for that matter, you said everything is available on the internet. I agree. But I never heard of the BLM movement until I found it on Instagram. And that is also a form of internet. And awareness, sure, it's important, and it's just as important as a solution. Like the BLM movement had a solution in the core, and unless and until the protest as a solution, the awareness has no point, was my original point. um I think we can go on about this for the rest of the night, but I think we should let Sam speak now, 'cause, yeah.
Thanks. But yeah, my reflection is kind of similar. And like Angel said, I have a lot more questions now that I wouldn't have if we hadn't done this. And I guess one of the bigger ones is, what can media do? Because like we were talking about is how violent protests get a lot more attention than peaceful ones. And like, I don't know what would happen if we reverse that, but maybe it would go back to like encouraging peaceful protests and draw more people to make like a really big effective peaceful protest. And there are a lot of those already, but if we give them media coverage, they could maybe stretch even further, because like I know a lot of my friends don't like who don't have Instagram or social media, and sometimes like we, and myself included, take it for granted that everyone has social media and therefore they know about everything related to the issue, or they're more aware of it. But like, that's not always true, and some people aren't aware of an issue if they don't have friends who go through that, or they don't do it themselves, and they don't have social media to have a wider platform to see it. So I guess both social media and just general news sources, as well as like how can we make protesting more accessible to people without like social media and stuff. I don't know if that was long, sorry.
No, you're good. I think those are all really good questions, and I'm left thinking about a lot of them as well. Okay, so Freya, this was your first trek, so would love to hear what you thought about the trek overall.
I absolutely enjoyed it because I don't think I'd be having such conversations otherwise. And the fact that I can have them with people who have really good opinions in it, similar or not similar to mine, and the fact that they're actually educated about it, I loved it. And I really hope I can attend more of these.
You
Yeah,
can attend more of these.
yeah, I send like all of the days and stuff on Monday, and so you can sign up for as many as you want. But thank you all for coming, and I will see you later. Bye.